Okay, hello everyone. Good evening. Today I'm joined, or good morning to the Californians. Today I'm joined by Muhammad Sahimi. He's a professor in chemical engineering in University of Southern California, and he wrote a very interesting article for antiwar.com, which was called "The Murder of Sahimi: Iranians' Quest for Democratic State and the Role of Outside Forces." And I encourage everyone to read this. So, Professor Sahimi, welcome.
It's good to be with you, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, sort of dig into the crux of the article. You sketched you used a metaphor that Iranians are between a rock and a hard place. First, on the one hand, they've got the oppressive government. You delved into the details of Mahsa Amini's death. Simultaneously, you make the argument that within the diaspora, there's a form of radicalization, and also there's outside interference trying to instigate riots or coups or things of this sort, right?
Yes, that's that has been going on at least for the past 20 years. Uh, in Iran, just like let's say here in the United States, we have radicals. These radicals want to have full control of everything. They don't want people to participate in a participatory democracy type of thing. They put down any protests, and the result of that has been vast economic corruptions, all sorts of crimes that have taken place over the past 30 years, 40 years, and so on. And the current protest in Iran is against, the radicals and what I often call in my articles the deep state, because we have a formal government, but we also have a sort of deep state that does a lot of things outside the legal framework that the Islamic Republic itself has set up. On the other hand, outside of the country, we have the Iranian diaspora. Now, the Iranian diaspora can be divided into two groups. One group uh, wants the Islamic Republic to go away and be replaced by a democratic system of government where every citizen is equal to every other citizen. Um, but they are opposed to, for example, American economic sanctions. They are opposed to use of military force. They are opposed to, for example, the type of actions that the NATO and the United States took against Libya, where in the name of humanitarian intervention, they went into Libya and overthrew Muammar Gaddafi's government. But then that resulted in more or less total destruction of Libya, partitioning it into different region under warlord to the point that we have now two governments in Libya, and they both claim to be the legitimate government of Libya. And at the same time, according to U.S. intelligence, we also have at least two or three terrorist groups that have bases in Libya, and from there
Yeah.
they carry out a lot of things. And if you remember, there was also a report about how Libya became a hub for slavery. People were being sold and bought as a slave, and this is 21st century. So this is one group of Iran. The other group of, and in my view, and based on what I know, the big majority of Iranians who live in diaspora belong to this group. But then we also have a minority of group that is willing to, in order to overthrow the Islamic Republic, is willing to do anything. In other words, they have advocated, not only they have supported economic sanctions, they have advocated even military actions. And now there's a third element, and these are a couple of small separatist groups that claim to speak for the people of the region that they want to apparently separate from Iran, such as, for example, the Kurdistan in western Iran on the border with Iraq. And now, even we didn't have this phenomenon before, but now the conversation about separatist groups and so on has also entered the general conversation about the future of Iran and so on. And the vast majority of Iranians are trapped between these two. The difference between these two groups of Iranian diaspora is that the majority is more or less silent, aside from people like me who write articles, have active Facebook, and so on. They don't have any way of communicating their views. On the other hand, the minority, which is supported by Iran's competitors, if not enemies, within the region in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, and also the United States, have all the loudspeakers, so to speak, in their hand. They bombard Iran with all sorts of programs all at the same time. They have many websites, whereas the people in the first group don't have any really a website to reflect their views. And they are supported by all sorts of groups, the Israeli lobby, the Saudi lobby, and now the Canadian government even has entered the picture, and so on. So the question of giving the right information to the young people of Iran who are struggling against the Tehran regime in order to have a better government, a democratic government, or at least a better government, is a real struggle, because we don't have the type of means that the minority has. And that has also made things very difficult for people like me. I, for one, am totally opposed to the theocracy that they have in Tehran. I believe in a democratic republic, and in fact, I supported the Iranian Revolution of 1979 when I was in my early 20s as a university student, simply because I thought the revolution would lead to a democratic republic. And in fact, the first draft of the constitutions that was written right after the revolution was a democratic republic. But because of all sorts of things that happened at that time, and because of the political vacuum that the Shah had created by exiling or jailing or executing or forcing into silence the opposition, and the only viable group that could take over were the clerics. And that's how the Iranian Revolution deviated from its true path. Instead of going towards a democratic republic, went to what we have now, which is a totally religious government, and a terrible one at that, and got Iran to the state that we are today.
I want to ask you about the nature of the religious government. I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but the Velayat Ifaiq, I think.
No, Velayat al-Faqih, yes.
Can you maybe explain to those who are not acquainted with how it works, what that the guardianship of the jurist is about, and also how that, I suppose, plays out in reality? Because there's always a difference between what's written on paper in a constitution and how the politics, evolves.
Well, according to the Iranian constitution, the faqih, or the supreme leader, has the final say on everything. And he does this through various means and various organs of the government that they have set up. In the original constitution that also contained this Velayat al-Faqih in the early 1980s, the Faqih didn't have as much power as Ayatollah Khamenei has now. But they revised the constitution in 1989 and gave much more power to the supreme leader than to the elected president. So basically, he can veto anything, and often he does. He also, in the constitution, we also have the Guardian Council that supposedly wants to make sure that every legislation that is passed by the Iranian parliament is in accordance with the Islamic teaching. But that has become also a tool for removing or eliminating the opposition, because that organ gave itself the power of vetting the candidates for national elections, such as presidential elections or parliamentary elections. And as a result, over time, the view of this Guardian Council, which is basically made of 12 people, 6 of whom are appointed by the supreme leader, and the other 6 are supposedly appointed by the parliament, but in fact, they are also basically more or less appointed by the supreme leader. And the view of this organ has become narrower and narrower, to the point that in the last parliamentary election, the elections weren't really meaning anything, because anybody who had said, the slightest things in criticizing the current state of affairs had been eliminated from running. The same is true for presidential election of a year and a half ago, where all the viable candidates were eliminated so that the ruling group can bring Raisi to power as president. And Raisi has proven to be, in my view, has proven to be a totally incompetent president. He doesn't know much. His view of the world are so outdated. As was pointed out during the presidential debate by one of the candidates that the Guardian Council had allowed to run, he doesn't have much education either. So, in addition, the cabinet that he brought to power or appointed are made of very radical people. Their views are not in harmony with the views of majority of Iranians, the vast majority of Iranians. They all belong to this radical group called Jebhe Paidari or Resistance Front, that are made of very radical right in Iran.
And when you
As a
say
result,
radical, I just want to sort of quantify that, because you have different forms of radicalism, within Iran as well. Is it necessarily religious, or is it militaristic as well, or the combination?
both actually, because not only they are religious radical, in other words, they have very extreme interpretation of Islamic teaching, but they are also very militaristic in the sense that uh, in their view, any protest, any legitimate protest should be put down by violence. And this has been shown in the past, over the past few years. We had demonstrations in January of 2018. We had demonstrations in November of 2019, and now we have demonstrations, the present demonstrations that started in September. In all 3 of these demonstrations, began totally peacefully. People were protesting, for example, in November of 2019, the sudden increase in the price of gasoline, which basically triggers a huge increase in the price of every other thing that you need for your everyday needs. And in fact, that was done without even letting the president at that time, Hassan Rouhani, know. This was done by the same radicals that I've been talking about. Or the demonstrations in January of 2018 began in a religious city of Mashhad in northeastern Iran, where the goal of the demonstrations was actually try to topple the Rouhani government that had come to power through popular vote back in 2017. But then that became an excuse for everybody else to come out and protest what was going on, and that spread throughout the country. So in this sense, when I talk about radicals, that's what I mean. Not only they are, their view of foreign policy is also very radical. They are basically looking at the world from a very narrow window of ideology that says that you know we have
And
to.
they see themselves also as persecuted, as if the West is always out to get Iran, which is not always untrue, to be truthful. But it's sometimes it's a paranoia that creates this irrational decision
That
making.
is very true. Well, I mean, we cannot ignore the fact that, for example, over the past 40 years, since the Iranian Revolution, the United States has imposed economic sanctions on Iran. Sometimes the sanctions have been mild, sometimes have been totally severe, as for example happened during the first couple of years, the 2 years during the 3 years from 2012 to 2015 during the Obama administration, and then during the Trump administration with the policy of maximum pressure. So there is no question that the West, through its economic sanctions and confrontational approach, has played an important role in what has happened in Iran. And in fact, a New York Times reporter, Muhammad Sahimi, published a very good report just a while ago, in which she stated, by quoting some facts, that U.S. economic sanctions has played a role in giving rise to the current situation. And the same minority of Iranians in diaspora attacked her fiercely for saying that. But this is something that all objective analysts agree that regardless of the nature of the Iranian government, there has always been pressure on Iran over the past 44 years since the Iranian Revolution. My personal belief has always been that even if we wake up tomorrow and find out that Iran has a totally democratic government, but a government that pursues Iran's national interests rather than being a docile republic when it comes to the West will still oppose this totally democratic government, because what they want is a government that has the interest of West in their hearts. I remember many years ago in 2006 or 2005, Condoleezza Rice, who was at that time, I believe, National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush, or maybe Secretary of State. It was Secretary of State. She was giving a testimony in the Senate, and she was asked why the United States opposes the late President Hugo Chavez so much. And the response of Condoleezza Rice very revealing. She said, because President Hugo Chavez does not have our interests in his heart. So this is the way they view the world. We want a government.
They want domination and submission. They don't want
Exactly, and so that has played. Now, when the Iranian government says things like that, they are correct. But the problem is that what they don't realize is that the fact that the West has been pressuring Iran does not give them the permission to do whatever they want within Iran against Iranian people. In fact, I would argue that a good government, even if that government wants to resist the pressure by the West, the best way of doing it is having a system of government that is supported by the majority of the people. When you have a political system that is supported by the majority of people in a big country like Iran with a strategic importance, then the West cannot do much. If, for example, Saddam Hussein in Iraq had the support of majority of Iraqi people, I believe Iraq would have never been invaded. But because Saddam Hussein represented only a very narrow portion of the population in Iraq, it was invaded. The same thing in Iran. So even if these religious people in Iran want to confront West or whatever they want to do, the best way to do it is to have a representative government in Iran which is supported by a majority of people, not a minority government that is opposed by a vast segment of the society. I would argue that at least 70% of the Iranians are opposed to this present system of government in Iran. So we have all sorts of complexity here that the Iranian nation has to deal with, from outside, from inside, from radicals on both sides, and so on.
Yeah, and you saying basically the radicals are not are the ones with the microphone at the moment. That
Exactly. I mean, it's the same in Iran. I mean, the majority of Iranian people don't have any microphone. They don't have any means of expressing their views. We have this vast national network of television and radio station, but that is always has always been controlled by the hardliners,
yeah.
and the hardliners use it basically as a propaganda rather than
Well,
giving.
I must say your propaganda is very interesting because when I was there, I was watching it with my mother-in-law, and I was so informed about what is wrong with America. I knew a bridge collapsed in Florida. I knew there was a dirty contract between a military contractor somewhere in Afghanistan. Like they went into detail in the analysis of what's
Oh
wrong
yeah,
with the rest.
oh yeah. I mean, some of the things that they say may be correct, but as I
Yeah.
said, this doesn't give them any permit for what they do within Iran. This is true. But on the other hand, this is also true in Iran. We have had vast economic corruptions to the point that even now, even the hardliners have to admit that there has been a lot of corruptions. Uh, every
Yeah.
week we hear somebody has been arrested, and the figures, the numbers that we hear about the extent of corruption are astronomical. On the orders of tens of billions of dollars in a country like Iran that has been under sanction for so long.
Well, it doesn't shock somebody from South Africa, and we're not being sanctioned, but the money is the same. But yes, I agree. There is, I mean, the corruption is obviously part of the issue. I want to ask you on the reform. I mean, you have been on record for defending Iran's nuclear program. I mean, am I correct with that?
Well, what I have defended is that when I started writing about Iran's nuclear program, the claim was that Iran's nuclear program is totally illegal. Uh, and that I was afraid at that time that it would be used as an excuse to attack Iran. This was in 2003, after the United States had invaded Iraq on the excuse that Iraq had an illegal nuclear program. And it was after that invasion that Iranian reformist president Muhammad Sahimi had submitted a comprehensive proposal to Washington for resolving all the issues between Iran and the United States, including putting Iran's very young nuclear program under complete and very strict control of International Atomic Energy Agency. And the Bush administration had rejected it out of hand. And in fact, Dick Cheney was quoted as saying that we don't negotiate with terrorists. And there was talk of invading Iran. The Nation reported that the journal Nation reported that the chat is that everybody goes to Baghdad, but the real man go to Tehran.
Well, I mean, Wesley Clark admitted something of that when
And
his statement.
yes, exactly. And Leslie Clark said that the Bush administration has plans for attacking 7 countries. And in fact, out of 7 countries, the only country that hasn't been attacked is Iran. If you look at the list of those 7 countries, 6 of them have been attacked. So, as somebody who has extensive knowledge about nuclear energy and also Iranian politics, I decided just to convey this message that Iranian nuclear program, uh, whether you oppose it or support it, is a totally legal program
Mhm.
because Iran has accepted all the provisions of nuclear non-proliferation treaty and has delivered on its obligation. Therefore, whether you agree with it or not, it is totally legal, and you cannot use it as an excuse to uh, attack you. And in fact, I must say, without meaning to really brag about it, a series of articles that I published at that time did influence the conversation about it, because at that time the conversation was that Iran has so much oil and gas. Why does it need nuclear energy? Uh, that was one of the things that they were saying. Or this program is totally not needed for Iran, whereas it was the United States in the 1970s, when the population of Iran was much smaller than the present population, convinced the Shah to set up a nuclear program, to
Yes.
buy 6 to 8 nuclear reactors and so on. So that means that the only problem that we had was the politics of it. At that time, we had a regime in Iran that was supported by the United States, was ally of the United States, and therefore they could get the Shah and the money that he was making from selling oil to pay back the United States by setting up a nuclear program. And in fact, like found documents about this in President Gerald Ford presidential library, where the all the documents that have been discussed in U.S. National Security Council during the Ford administration. I brought them to the attention of the public. Uh, Now, whether Iran needs nuclear energy is a separate issue for Iran. Whether Iran needs enrichment of uranium, and many
Mm.
countries have nuclear reactors but don't have a uranium enrichment program. So that's a question that must be debated. And I have always been of the opinion that uh, uh, economically, it is not economical to have a uranium enrichment program in Iran, simply because Iran does not have enough uranium, natural uranium ore, to refine it and then enrich it for use in nuclear energy. Um, so that's a separate issue from nuclear energy. In my view, Iran does need nuclear energy uh, as one of the options for a cleaner energy. And at the same time, uh, Iran is affected by severe drought, and this is a worldwide problem. And the only solution, viable solution at this point, seems to be using the ocean's water to desalinate it and pipeline it to central part of Iran and so on. But that needs huge amount of energy for desalination, and therefore a network of nuclear reactors can be set up on the shores of the Persian Gulf, for example. The only one that Iran has is on the shores of the Persian Gulf.
In Bushehr, right? Yeah.
Bushehr, yes. And that energy could be used for desalination of water and supplying water to uh, southern Iran and central Iran. So
Well,
in that sense, it is a good idea. But as I said, this is separate from the issue of whether Iran should have a uranium enrichment program or not.
but did they? I mean, I read Gareth Porter's book on Iran called The Manufacturing Crisis. And I also spoke to the former head of South Africa's nuclear agency, okay, who was responsible for dismantling the apartheid bombs. I spoke to
Yeah,
him, and he confirmed to me, he said his suspicion is that Gareth Porter is correct, that Iran has never really had a serious attempt to make a bomb, but they've had a capability program. Now, I know that's contentious. I know that probably America doesn't agree with that, but I see a few weeks ago, even the US government came out saying something similar. And isn't this sort of lie or misperception part of the problem as well?
see, there is a history here that is never spoken in public. When the Iranian Revolution came, the Iranian government said that we don't need nuclear energy. And in fact, when I came to the United States in 1978, the Shah was still in power, and I was supposed to receive a scholarship, full scholarship for my doctoral degree from Atomic Energy Organization of Iran to get my degree and go back to Iran. But then when the revolution came the next year, I never received any scholarship because I came to the United States in the fall of 1978, and that was at the height of the Iranian Revolution. So when the next year I went back to Iran and asked about my scholarship, they told me that, well, we don't need nuclear energy, and we have decided to downsize it greatly, and therefore there is no need for so many recipients of a scholarship. But then Iraq, with direct encouragement of the United States, attacked Iran. And Iranian government knew that Iraq had a nuclear program since early 1970s. And in fact, in June of 1981, Israeli bombers attacked Iraq's nuclear reactor that was being built at Osirak near Baghdad and destroyed it. So the Iranians knew that Iraq did have a nuclear program. So they wanted to restart the program as sort of a deterrent against the regime of Saddam Hussein. But when they wanted to do this, they wanted to do it with full transparency. They asked International Atomic Energy Agency to go to Iran and does a study and identify the expertise that Iran needs and so on, and help Iran, and the program would be under full control or inspection by the IAEA. And IAEA presented a report in 1985 to the Board of Governors of the agency, recommending that Iran be helped with setting up a small nuclear program so that it will be gradually expanded. But it was the United States that vetoed that suggestion and did not allow IAEA to go into Iran and help Iran. Whereas if it had done so, the program would have been totally transparent right from the beginning, and also it would have been under a strict inspection of the IAEA. So what the Iranians decided to do was that they would do it in secret. So the program basically went underground in 1989, and the goal was to have a reliable and credible deterrent against Iraq. Now, U.S. intelligence agencies, if you remember, published a national estimate, intelligence estimate in November of 2006, in which they stated that Iran did have a research program for learning how to make a bomb, but it was stopped in 2003. And there is no evidence since then that Iran has restarted that program. So the question that at that time nobody asked was, okay, if Iran did have it and it did stop it in 2003, what was the significance of 2003? Why was it that it was stopped in 2003? If it was because the United States invaded Iraq, so Iranians would have been more afraid to be invaded, they would not have stopped it. So if the program was something against the West, for example, they would have accelerated rather than stop it. But the fact of the matter is the program was as a deterrent for the regime of Saddam Hussein. Once the regime of Saddam Hussein was overthrown, there was no need for such a program, and it was stopped. And in fact, evidence suggests that the way U.S. intelligence agency became aware of the fact that the program had been stopped was that they had eavesdropped the conversation between Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the brain behind Iran's nuclear program that was assassinated by Israel in December of 2020, in which he had said in his phone conversation that the government has stopped the program and the government has cut off all the funding for it, and therefore the program has stopped. And since then, there has never been any evidence that the Islamic Republic has taken further steps towards making nuclear bomb. Bill Burns, the director of CIA, said a few months ago that we see no evidence that Iran is moving toward making a bomb. And just a few weeks ago, as you pointed out, the Pentagon, in its assessment, said that there is no evidence that Iranian leadership has made any decision to move towards nuclear bomb. So they have admitted this now formally, transparently, and yet everybody talks about the threat by Iran against the rest of the world because of its nuclear program.
Right, and that to me is one of the bigger lies that's flowing around at the moment, that really needs to be exposed before. But I mean, in that light, I mean, it puts the Obama deal in perspective, because my suspicion is Obama's administration realized that this was a fabricated crisis, and that is why they used it to approach with Iran. Now, Trump came in, he tore up the deal, um, assassinated Qasem Soleimani, it was a major crisis in Iran. I was there almost half a year after Qasem Soleimani was killed,
Oh,
and I can tell you, in every street vendor in the country, I saw a photo of him. There was an enormous anger that it created in the society, and I think it was genuine. So it sort of, just to give you a view on here, but like this constant um, I mean, mistake that the United States makes, because it sort of over evaluates the threat of Iran.
they never learn anything from their long experience with Iran. I mean, we all know that the CIA staged a coup in 1953 to overthrow the democratic government of Dr. Muhammad Sahimi. That was a grave mistake. Then they supported, not only they put the Shah back in power, they also supported his dictatorship for 25 years. That gave rise to Iranian Revolution of 1979. If Mossadegh had not been overthrown, or at the very minimum, the Shah had been encouraged and forced to take deep, meaningful reforms in Iran and gradually become a constitutional monarchy rather than an absolute monarch that he was and a dictator, uh, we would not have Iranian revolution to begin with. But then the Iranian Revolution came because it was obvious that the Shah regime could not continue the way it was, and the Shah realized that just too late, only 2-3 months before he was basically overthrown. And then after that, mistake after mistake after mistake has been made. They supported Iraq to invade Iraq, and and not only the United States, but also France and Britain and so on, supported Iraq during the war with Iraq. Towards the end of Iran-Iraq war, even NATO entered the picture because they sent their navy to Persian Gulf to reflag Kuwaiti oil tankers or Emirat oil tankers with US flag or France flag and so on, so that it won't be attacked by Iranian forces, because those countries had provided upward of $50 billion in financial help to Iraq to continue fighting with Iran. And as a result, they attacked Iranian oil fields, offshore Iranian oil fields. They attacked Iranian navy and basically destroyed half of it. They shot down Iranian passenger plane that killed 290 people in July of 1988, and so on and so forth. Then, after all these years, the Obama administration reached an agreement in Iran regarding its nuclear program. Iran delivered on its obligation, but then Trump came to power and he basically reimposed all the sanctions and exited the agreement. So mistake after mistake after mistake has been made. This is not to say that the Iranian regime or ruling group has not had any role in it. They also, with some of their policies, they also have played a major role in it. In particular, their anti-Israel rhetoric has always been detrimental, in my view, to Iran's true national interests. Because surely they should be aware of the fact that Israel and its supporters and its lobbies in the United States have great influence. And as long as any regime anywhere in this world has this type of rhetoric against Israel, they will do their best to undermine that regime, undermine that country. This is not something that is secret or not unknown. And yet they have continued to do this because they basically have defined themselves in terms of hostility towards Israel. Now, I myself have been a strong critic of Israel because of its treatment of Palestinian people and the fact that the U.S. has basically has given it, you know, has allowed it to do whatever they want and supported with $4 billion a year military aid and so on. But ultimately, the problem between Palestinians and Israel is a problem between Palestinians and Israel. And all we, for example, Iranians can do is providing moral support to Palestinians, not to do anything that would harm our own national interests because of.
But I mean, when the Camp David Accords was taken place between Israel and Palestine, there was an attempt at peace. I think the first time there was probably going to be a two-state
Yes.
solution, although that's probably badly defined. And the accusation has been that Hamas was supported by Iran. So that came to the detriment of the Palestinians.
Hamas is supported by Iran. This is true, and this is something that, as far as I know, only radicals in Iran agree on. As far as I know, there is sympathy for Palestinian people, but not to the extent that we should support Hamas that rejects the Camp David and to the to hurt Iranian national interests because we provide support for Hamas. And I must say that although I have a lot of sympathy for Palestinian people living in Gaza, Hamas has not even been a reliable ally for Iranian radicals. Because, for example, when the war in Syria started, Hamas didn't support the government in Syria, and the government in Syria is an ally of Iranian government, and Hamas didn't support President Bashar Assad. So they are not even a reliable ally for Iranian radicals who continue to support them. So this accusation is actually true. Iran has supported Hamas. That cannot be ignored. So if we look at, for example, from the perspective of somebody from outside that is looking at this picture of Middle East, it is true that Iranian government has had policies that has been detrimental to what U.S. considers as its national interest. But at the same time, the Iranians in the past have also tried to accommodate U.S. in one of its policies in Middle East that benefits Iran. For example, when United States invaded Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, the Khatami administration worked closely with Bush administration. It opened Iran a space to U.S. aircraft that could fly over Iran. It provided a lot of intelligence to U.S. forces because Iran has always been present in Afghanistan. And in fact, the Northern Alliance, a group that opposed Taliban in Afghanistan, had been armed and trained by Iran for many years. And it was Northern Alliance that first entered Kabul and overthrew the Taliban in the fall of 2001. Or during U.S. war with Iraq over Kuwait in 1990, 1991, Iran did not allow any Iraqi forces, for example, to enter Iran or to take refuge in Iran and basically stay neutral. Or during invasion of Iraq by the United States in 2003, in the earlier stages, Iran didn't do anything that would be, even though it opposed it formally, but it didn't do anything to undermine it. But only when the United States started to threaten Iran with invasion, and given the fact that U.S. had upward of 165,000 best equipped troops in Iraq, the fear in Iran was that U.S. was going to invade Iran. And in fact, many documents that were published later on indicated that the Bush administration did intend to invade Iran, did intend to attack Iran. It was only because of the wisdom of senior officers in the Pentagon, for example, that didn't want a war with Iran, that prevented it. In one episode, it's documented that Dick Cheney had asked senior Pentagon officials to draw a plan for attacking Iran. And he had been told that, well, we can always attack Iran, we can always destroy a lot of things in Iran, but then that would start a war that would last 15, 20 years. So, what is our scenario for ending the war? Because we can always start the war, but ending it will not be under our control. Ending it would be under both sides' control. So what is the scenario under which we end the war? And Dick Cheney didn't have any response to it. And that was one factor that prevented attacking Iran.
Wow.
And then when US national intelligence came out in November of 2006, that said that Iran doesn't have any program to make a nuclear bomb, that basically put a stop to everything. George Bush himself said later on that, how could I attack Iran when my own intelligence agencies tell me that Iran doesn't have a program for making nuclear bombs? So we have always had this tension, this possibility that a major war between Iran and the United States would start. That would be a disaster, not only for the Middle East, but I believe for the entire world.
Yeah, I mean, nobody, I mean, except the fanatics would like to see a war between any countries, but
Yes,
unfortunately it
yes,
occurs.
yes,
I want to, but you know, you're sketching here a picture, which is what I often get from Iranian reform-minded people, that the big threat to Iran is external, you can call it oppression or threats by the United States. But what I've never truly understood is why can't the Iranian government come around to say, even if we accept that we are hated by the world or whatever, why don't we move in the direction of civil rights for our own citizens?
exactly. And that's what I was saying. I was saying, even if you want to accept the notion that we are going to confront the whole world because we are on moral high grounds and so on, the best way to do it is to have a representative government within Iran, which is supported by vast majority of people, which means giving them their citizen rights, civil rights, human rights, have democratic election, have representative government, and all that. Once a people are happy with their own political system, they would defend it against any external threat. So that would be the best strategy. But unfortunately, the radicals, the clerics and their supporters, the radicals in Iran, don't see it that way. And I think the reason is that they look at these things ideologically rather than pragmatically. That, hey, this is in our interest to do like this. And that was, in fact, one ideals of Iranian revolution. We had a revolution because people were tired of dictatorship of Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. They didn't bargain one dictatorship with another one, uh, you know. So, but that's basically more or less has happened. Now, the other worst aspect of it is that from the beginning of revolution up until, let's say, 20 years ago, Iran never had democratic elections, but Iran had competitive elections, elections that were meaningful. In other words, we had many groups of people that would have different views, would compete more or less with each other, and people would elect. So those elections were meaningful in the sense that they were competitive. But gradually, because it became obvious that more and more people opposed the rule of clerics, the elections became narrower and narrower and narrower through the power of the Guardian Council that I mentioned, and that vets the candidates and does not allow a lot of candidates whom they know oppose the present system, at least the way it is run, to run in the elections. So elections gradually lost a lot of the meanings within the Iranian politics, to the extent that for the first time in the history of Islamic Republic, the fraction of people who voted in the last presidential election fell below 50%. it was always at least 55% to 60%, and in some elections it was upward of 85%. For example, in elections of 2009 or 2017. But people are frustrated, people are disappointed, and people have lost hope that this government can be reformed. I believe it can be, but my view may not be shared by a lot of other people.
Because my sense of it has been that given that Iran has elections and they are legitimate in a certain sense, in the fact that the votes are counted and people get elected, although that has been disputed once. But generally speaking, they have political structure. It's vastly different than what many African countries faced, which didn't have any. So the reforms that are required, that my sense of it has been, is actually not as significant as many people would think. First of all, the clerical regime has to be challenged. It can't survive in its current form, clearly. And second thing is, they must have free and open elections, and then the civil rights will follow from that.
Exactly. That's I totally agree. I mean, if we have free elections in which everybody can compete and try to get people's confidence to vote for them, then we will have a parliament or majlis, as they say in Iran, and that is elected by the people. And then we can go after revising the constitution and removing the post of supreme leader, become or actually say have a referendum in Iran, which the constitution of the Islamic Republic actually allows it. It allows referendum on important national issues. But that has, of course, been blocked because the cleric know that if there is a true referendum, they will be defeated.
So, I mean, so the clerics see reform as the end of their regime, basically.
Exactly. That's how they see it, and I must say they're not wrong. They know it, but that's as you said, that's the only way to get out of this peacefully. What people like me are
how?
worried is that this confrontation between people and the state will get more and more violent to the point that at some point it would start a civil war, the type of that we had in Syria, for example. Uh, if you look at,
What do you say then, Augustine, to I mean, there's a lot of young Iranians that really feel hopeless, and I've noticed that when I was there, who would easily fall for revolutionary ideology. I mean, I look at what happened in Egypt. I look at what happened in Zimbabwe. I look at what happened in many places in the world. It's very rare that a revolution results in civil rights. In Egypt was the military. I understand, the desperation of the people there, and I understand that they've got no outlet and they are really fed up and everything. But I mean, how do you convince those people to channel their energy in a direction of reform?
that's a tough question, and to be honest, I don't know. Uh, the effort of people like me has always been try to, in any way that we can, feed Iranian people with the right information. If they have the full picture of what's going on, uh, then a solution may emerge. One thing that we have to remember is this: the Green Movement of 2009 was a middle class movement. It was inspired by the middle class. The demonstrations in January of 2018 and November of 2019 were inspired by poor people. The middle class did not take part in these demonstrations simply because Iranian middle class is a very educated, very well connected class of people. They are well aware of what has been happening in the region, particularly in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, and so on, and does not wish to do something that will transform Iran to another Syria. In the present demonstrations that started in September, in the first week or two of demonstrations, that were relatively peaceful, the middle class did participate because the middle class had lost hope, has lost hope that through reform we can do something. But then when the demonstration turned violent by the security forces and then by at least a segment of demonstration, then the middle class basically withdrew from the demonstrations. That's why you see that the size of demonstrations, they have continued, but their size is much smaller than what it
Yeah.
was at the very beginning, simply because in major cities, the middle class removed itself from such demonstrations because, as I said, they are well aware of what's going on and they don't wish Iran to become another Syria or another Libya. And the young people of Iran, which, as you said, have lost hope for a better future, should also take that into consideration. After all, we first have to preserve Iran in order to set up a democratic state. We don't want burnout fields and destroyed country in order to make a democracy. Democracy would not mean anything. Uh, Talk to Syrian people about democracy right now after the country has been destroyed is meaningless. It's a matter of survival. Uh, who cares about democracy? So we have to keep this in our mind that we have to preserve Iran first, and then talk about a democratic state, a democratic system of government, and so on.
When it comes to the equality of women, this was the first time I think that such a protest went so viral. There's been previous protests, but this is really the first time it's got nationwide, international attention. I mean, I saw on Iranian TV they were debating the hijab. Okay, not like you and I would probably debate it, but they were at least saying something. Don't you think that at least they have realized that this is not something that can continue? Because I'll give you some statistics, which is remarkable in a certain way. I mean, 60 to 70% of Iranian mathematics and science graduates are women.
Yes,
Iranian women are some of the most educated women in the world. I mean, it surely can't continue.
yeah, I totally agree. I mean, this is the fundamental contradiction in Iran's political system. It was this system that allowed women to get into university at large numbers to the extent that, as you said, 60% of university students in Iran are women. Okay, so that gives rise to a very educated, very well aware, very informed segment of the society. Iranian women have always been part of the active political process. In Iran, we have professors, we have uh, attorneys, we have managers, we have human rights activists, we have political activists, and so on. But the effort of the state to impose restrictions on the way that women like to live, and particularly the effort by the radicals who would like to see a return of women to their homes to be only mother and homemaker and so on, has angered a lot of Iranian women. There are many Iranian women who themselves believe in hijab, but also do not believe that this should be mandatory. It's because, after all, it's a belief in your values. If you think you should cover yourself with hijab, you should be free to do that. If you don't believe in it, you shouldn't do that. I come from a religious family. My parents were very religious. My sisters are religious, but none of them wears hijab. My own wife has religious belief. I have religious belief, and my wife doesn't wear hijab because this is just a matter of personal choice and personal belief that so and and it's not just the hijab. It is the humiliation that comes with it. When you arrest a young woman like Mahsa Amini on the street simply because her hijab was, let's say, here rather than being here, and then you take it to detention center, and the young woman loses her life. That touches people very deeply. Why should a young woman at this age lose her life because of a job, which is, after all, should be a choice for women? And this young woman, Mahsa Amini, when you look at her picture, her hijab wasn't in fact as bad in the sense of how the radicals in Iran define it, as a lot of other women in Iran. But it also has had, in my view, a net positive effect, and that is that now a lot of women go outside without hijab, and they don't, more or less, nothing happens to them. That morality police, or as Iran would say, Gasht Irshad, doesn't operate more or less anymore.
But do you think that that is going to be abolished, that those reforms will take place?
If not officially, but unofficially.
No.
Unofficially, it will be abolished. They are never going to admit that they have abolished it. But at the same time, I don't think they are going to enforce it.
Well, when I was there, it depends which city you're in. If you're in Kolm, they wear a chador. If you're in the north, Rash, those places, in restaurants, I saw on numerous occasions women not wearing it. Sometimes they wear it, but you can barely see it. So it was clearly, I could see that the trend's changing already as I traveled through the country. Mm-hmm. So it was a matter of time for this to happen, I think.
I mean, at the very beginning of the revolution, one of the major figures in Iranian revolution, Ayatollah Mahmoud Talbani, who passed away less than a year after the revolution, she was a very enlightened cleric, and he was a very enlightened cleric, and he was very progressive. And at that time, he said that hijab is a matter of belief, not a matter of mandatory. It's not mandatory. You either believe in it or you don't believe in it. If you believe in it, you cover yourself. You don't believe in it, you shouldn't be forced to cover it. Nobody listened to him, and that we can see now what's going on.
I've got a question for you from one from the audience. It says, what is your suggestion to get out of the situation when dealing with a government that, as you said, sees reform as a dead threat and has brutally suppressed any request of that sort several times?
Yes, I see the question. You see that, in my view, the best way to do it is through a national civil movement. This national civil movement has many components. It's not just demonstrations on the street. That's one component of it, but that's not all of it. It could be civil disobedience. For example, yesterday, Iran national soccer team was to play England. When they played the Islamic Republic national song, they didn't sing with it. That is a civil disobedience at that level. But you can have all sorts of civil disobedience at the national level. Don't pay your electricity bill. Don't pay your gas bill. Don't pay your water bill. Don't pay this. Don't pay that. Anything that feeds the government. If you can, go on a strike, a national strike. These are all civil. These are all civil efforts. They are non-violent, but they also deprive the system from many, many resources that it has, until it actually retreats and starts to negotiate with the opposition. The hardliners, or those who are in power, will never negotiate with the opposition as long as they have the upper hand. But once the force of Iranian people reaches sort of an equilibrium with the forces of the ruling elite and their supporters, then things can happen. The other thing that we have to remember is that the hardliners in Iran, the radicals, do have a social base of support. It's not that um, they don't have any supporters. Uh, there are very good indication that at least 20% of the people support these people for a variety of reasons. Some people
Right.
say they're interested in it. Some people believe in it. We also have to remember that in last year's election, which was a worst election in Iran, because as I said, the percentage of people who voted fell below 50% for the first time. Still, more than 40% of the people voted. So that still shows that not only these people have a social base of support, but they can also attract another segment of the society. So we have to keep that in mind also. The other thing is that we have to remember that unlike the regime of the Shah, where his supporters had somewhere to go, they went to Europe, they went to the United States. The supporters of the present regime doesn't have any place to go. Nobody will accept them. Therefore, they will stay in Iran. Now, you either provide a possibility of life for them so that they can realize that the present situation cannot continue as it is and things have to change fundamentally such that they can also live in that change system, or they would fight to the death. So we have to make a choice here. What is it that we want? Uh, we want to burn out everything, destroy the country in order to get rid of the present system, or we want to reach some sort of accommodation where we move at least towards a better government, taking steps towards a better, more representative government, and eventually reach a democratic state.
Oh, I think on that note, Professor Saimi, thank you very much for the conversation, and for everyone listening, thank you.
I thank you for inviting me to your program. I appreciate it.